Welcome to the first episode of SLP Talks. I'm your host, Asil Salam, and in today's episode, I'm going to be breaking down all things SLP in my internship. As a quick overview, I'm an undergrad student majoring in linguistics. I hope to do a master's in speech-language pathology. But first, I wanted to gain some experience, which is why I'm here. I began an internship at Aspire Speech, where I had a speech path supervisor teach me all the ins and outs of what it's like to have an SLP private practice. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. The behind the scenes and what I've learned over the past month and a half. The first few weeks of my internship, I was given administrative work for two reasons. One, so that I get a good idea of how client information and materials are stored and organized. And two, to lay a foundation for the work I will do later on. To understand how to create material and where to store it, I needed to understand that first. The administrative work consisted of me downloading and uploading files. Rana, my supervisor, had two computers with client information. The first computer is old with files that weren't compatible with the newer computer. So my job was to convert those files into a compatible format and organize them based on year. Once that was done, I had to enter any missing patient information onto an Excel sheet. This sheet included name, date of birth, phone number, or the parent's phone number if it was a child, address, initial consult date, last date of visit, 18th birthday, and 10 years after the 18th birthday, the 28th birthday, and the shred date. This is an incredibly complex sheet with a lot of information, and rightly so. When dealing with children in the SLP area, patient records cannot be shredded. This was the term we used to refer to getting rid of a patient's records until they were 28 years old. That's why we have the 18th, the 28th birthday, and a shred date. It's also important to note the initial visit and the last visit as well. This explains why there are a lot of files and binders for patients because we have to hold on to them until they turn 28. For adult patients, the process is less tedious. The documents must be kept until 10 years after their last visit. When I first found this out, I thought it was so odd and weird, and of course so did Rana. Like, why would we need to keep their files until they're 28? It's unlikely that they'll ever need their file again. But this is just the law according to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, which probably means that this is the case with physicians, not just SLPs. Alright, so after I got a good idea of what to expect, how to prepare and store documents, file information, things like that, I was ready to become a little more hands-on. What this looked like was Rana asking the parents for permission, first and foremost, of course, for me to sit in and observe and then assist. I was assigned to one particular case, mainly so that I can focus all my attention and work on this client. He's a 6-year-old boy that's delayed in reading, and his mom would like him to be up to level reading to first grade by September. In preparation for assisting Rana, I was trained specifically for this case. First, Rana explained the approach she is taking to achieve the end goal. Second, she showed me how to explain it and teach it to the child. And third, she went through why she does what she does. The process seems and sounds pretty simple, but is more complex than it appears. To get a child who has little to no reading skills, there's a type of quote-unquote formula to follow, and this formula is called CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant. This is the formula the words have to follow. For example, this means words like bat, mug, fix, set, log, etc. It's also important that the sounds of the vowels are consistent. For example, A is A, E is E, I is I, O is O, and U is O. The reason why I mention this is because although English has 5 vowels, and sometimes Y, it actually has 20 vowel sounds. And sounds, also known as phonetics, which is the study of speech sounds, is more important when it comes to reading and speaking than understanding and recognizing the letters themselves. So it's really important to make sure that the CVC words we had the same pronunciation of the vowel. So an example of the same vowel having different pronunciations is bass and bass. Ignoring the fact that these are 4-letter words, since, that isn't the focus right now, both of these words have the vowel A, but the vowel is pronounced differently in each one. As for the 4-letter words, we only used words like hill, lick, sick, things like that. I would explain to the child that the 2 L's make the sound of one. This may seem like common sense, but to a child's brain, those two letters are pronounced separately, and that's exactly what he did the first time. The first time he read hill, he read it as h-e-l-l. As for words like sick and lick, the ck at the end makes one sound, k, and I explained that to him as well. That's why we focus on pronunciation as opposed to the letters themselves. So, as for the sessions, after Rana explained it to me and I observed her, I got to do a session on my own. How this would go is that the child points at each letter, sounds them out, and then puts them all together. I would model it for him, and then he would repeat after me. So it would go something like this. K, a, t, cat. Sounding out the phonemes individually is called phoneme segmentation. After some improvement a few weeks later, Rana instructed me not to say the whole word after sounding out the letters, so that it increases in difficulty when he started to get the hang of it. So I'll sound out the letters, but I won't put it all together. After he started to get a handle on things, there was a new challenge when it came to teaching kids how to read. Rana told me that children tend to memorize words, as opposed to memorizing how to put the sounds together. To solve this issue and to prevent them from memorizing words, as the children become more proficient in reading, we would create nonce words, or pseudo words. Nonce means words that don't exist, although a better term for these made-up words would be pseudo words. These also mean words that don't exist, but these are words that follow the phonological rules of English. Specifically for our sake because we're teaching English, but of course is applicable to any language. Quickly defined, phonology is the study of sound patterns. Every language has a certain sound pattern, and for English, this explains why blick could be an acceptable English word, but bnick can't be. Examples of pseudo words that we could give kids are kig, bov, jik. When a child attempts to read these, it'll give us an indication as to whether they memorize words or they're able to read the pseudo words. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the end goal is to have the child accomplish phonemic awareness and phonemic decoding. Susan McShane in the National Institute for Literacy defines phonemic awareness as awareness of speech sounds and phonemic decoding as making the connection between the letters and the words they represent, which is what we want kids to have. This seems like a process that goes hand in hand, and yes, while it does overlap, phonemic awareness and phonemic decoding are somewhat different. What I noticed in the kid I was working with is that he was somewhat able to detect the phonemes in the words. Phonemes are smallest units of sound in a spoken language. This means that in the word dog, for example, he'd say d, a, g. That's phonemic awareness. But he only got that weeks after practice. Susan said that this is because phonemic awareness is not acquired naturally as we learn how to speak. It's learned through reading and writing. And for slow or poor readers, this can be really hard, especially as they get older. So to develop phonemic decoding, we need to work on phonemic awareness. Another technique I was instructed to use was phonemic blending. So as I previously mentioned, after I modeled the sounds for him, like d, a, g, I don't say the full word right away or quickly, like dog. I try to say the letter slowly, like dog. This way, this prompts the child to put it all together. Sometimes he'd get it, like he'd be able to say dog. And sometimes he doesn't, because for someone who has weak phonemic blending skills, this can be a challenge. In a study conducted by Kenyatta Rivers, Linda Lombardino, and Cynthia Thompson in the American Journal of Speech-Language Pathology, they used CVC, CV, and VC pseudo words to teach kindergartners how to read. With consistent training, they found that decoding training positively affected word recognition and spelling skills. So this is all to say that with consistent training, and with the few times I saw that boy, he showed improvement in recognizing phonemes and showed improvement in reading. After that, I began to make material for him. It may seem like I was working backwards, but it was a good idea to work with the material Rana already had, get an understanding of what it's supposed to look like, and then make my own. Examples of the materials we used specifically for the 6-year-old boy are coconuts with CVC words inside that he glues on a palm tree, spots that he glues on a cheetah, things like that. For the first half of the session, we would practice reading words that were on a list, but we needed to make sure not to do that for the entire session or else the kid would get restless and bored. So we needed to incorporate an activity. For each kid, this activity was different. For the kid that needed to read, it involved CVC words. For kids that are just too active and restless during sessions, that looked like coloring pages, or incentives or rewards after every achievement. By experience, I realized that it's up to us to gauge what the needs of each individual kid are and tailor the activities based on what would help them the best instead of one activity for all the kids. What I found really cool was how Rana wanted to use AI somehow when creating material. So that's one of the things I worked on. Like I mentioned, very specific CVC words can be used because of the vowel. So that's what I asked ChatGPT to generate for me. I got a good amount of CVC words to use in new material that fit the criteria we were looking for. Alright, so that was a breakdown of the major projects I worked on. Moving on, I'm gonna get into smaller scale projects I worked on. As an overview, according to the Canadian Institute for Health Information, SLPs identify, diagnose, and treat communication disorders across the lifespan. Depending on the range of the speech path and whether or not they're a private practice, they can decide what cases to accept, and that was the case for Aspire Speech. Rana accepted cases, apart from the regular cases an SLP takes on. She also accepted cases that needed help with reading, writing, even older kids who needed help with writing essays, stories, and overall help in the middle school English curriculum. Those were some cases I helped with, though not directly with them, more behind-the-scenes work. For example, I created a rubric for writing narrative stories. I also copied down important pages that were relevant to writing from a textbook to make them easier to access, to send to the client's parents, and to use them during sessions. What I was glad about was that my knowledge of middle school and high school tutoring kicked in. I'm also an English tutor, so having that information at the back of my head made creating the rubrics and noting pages down for that sort of thing easier. Okay, so now that I've gone through the most valuable and educational part, for me at least, the parts that I'm more familiar with, now I'm going to talk about the things I needed help with the most. Like I previously mentioned, the Excel sheet we used had columns for the client's 18th and 28th birthday and the shred date, all of which need formulas to calculate when that day is. My previous knowledge of Excel was minimal, just the basics. And if there's one thing about me is that me and math don't get along. But like any other project, it's meant to be educational and beneficial and even get me out of my comfort zone. So one of my tasks was to familiarize myself with Excel and at least understand basic formulas. So I understood how to multiply, divide, add, and subtract. It was definitely not a linear process. I had to use the help of websites, YouTube videos, and trial and error until I got it. But that's definitely not to say that I've mastered it, but I've clearly got a long road ahead of me if I want to pursue SLP, which, I do. An interesting conversation I had with Rana is how chaotic having an SLP private practice can be. With the few days a week I saw Rana, even I could tell that it was almost 24/7 having a private practice, as in the things she had to do were almost non-stop. She often explained how tedious, chaotic, and things just seem to never end, like it's one storm after another. And I'm sure if she were an employee at a clinic, things would definitely be less chaotic. It not only seemed, but it is daunting. And I remembered an important point, that every rewarding career is going to be tough. I highly doubt that there's a rewarding career out there that isn't. And I don't mean tough as being a physician necessarily is, but all careers present their own challenges. This reminded me of an important point my EDS professors would tell me, that higher education is hard regardless what you go into. So it's important to make sure that you are passionate and you enjoy what you're doing. So I thought about it and I told Rana, yes, of course it's difficult and it's a lot, but it's also extremely rewarding. And she, of course, agreed. She said that when a child comes in not knowing how to read and leaves reading grade level, for example, it's an amazing thing to witness and be a part of. So if I had to leave with one lesson, or at least the lesson I valued the most, is that I realized how much work it's going to be. I also realized that my experience could have gone one of two ways. Either I would have known that this path isn't for me, or I would have been drawn to it all the more. So regardless of the outcome, I'm glad that I got to see the pretty, the ugly, and everything in between, so I could make the decision that was best for me. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please tune in for the next episode, where I'm going to be talking about what I wish I did differently and what I'm glad I did. Thank you for listening.